Okay, hello there guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Alex and I'm going to be doing something new today, something I've never tried before, and that is a tier list video. I see that these tier lists, well, they've been around for a while now, but becoming more and more popular on YouTube and just other places online. And essentially what you do is just basically tier rank a set of, whether it be albums, films, something within kind of a collective that you can group together. So I thought today it might be nice to do a Bob Dylan tier list, considering I'm a music themed channel and specifically a Bob Dylan themed channel. I thought, yeah, we would do a Bob Dylan tier list. So I'm going to be ranking his studio output, so all of his studio albums, obviously from 1962 onwards, with his self-titled album, right the way through to Rough and Rowdy Ways. You can see I've made a tier for the bootleg series along the bottom there, because we're not going to be ranking those. Additionally, we're not going to be ranking live albums, any of that stuff. It's just going to be the studio albums. And trust me, there's plenty of them, so you can see them all there. We're all ready to go. So we're going to start off with Bob Dylan from 1962. Now, I'm not going to be talking in depth about any of these albums because I don't want the video to be 2 hours long. But I do have some reviews. I haven't reviewed the debut album yet, but I have reviewed the subsequent 5. Yeah, the next 5 I do have reviews for on my channel. So if you want more in-depth thoughts, head over to the channel and check those reviews out. But right, self-titled album from 1962. Where am I going to put this? I think this is going to go in the C tier. Purely because I enjoy the album, and it's actually an album that I listen to more now than I used to. But there's only 2 original tracks on the self-titled album, and despite, I think his vocal performances are top notch on this album. I think he's obviously got that raw aesthetic to him. He's kind of an unpolished product at this point, and there's some great cover versions on here. Obviously, he was doing a lot of traditional folk standards, kind of songs that were popular at the time: House of the Rising Sun, Pretty Peggy-O, See That My Grave Is Kept Clean, which he did again on the Basement tapes. So it's a good album, but considering there's only 2 original tracks, I think I'm going to put it in the C tier. So solid start, but I know it was an album that Dylan himself wanted to quickly move on from. Right, Freewheeling Bob Dylan is up next from 1963, and many people would put this in the S tier. I'm going to put it in the A tier, simply because I think I've overplayed it at this stage. Obviously, this was the launching pad for Dylan's career. He went on from this to obviously write spectacularly for pretty much his whole career. This was really the launching pad for him. It's a great album, what can I say? It's got so many masterpieces on it, from Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, Masters of War. Obviously got Blowin' in the Wind on here, which became a big hit for him and other people as well. But I think for me, it's just, personally speaking, I've overplayed this album, and it's not an album that I return to super often. So I'm going to leave it in the A tier, but many people justifiably would put it in the S tier. So right, Times They Are Changing, which is the first of 2 albums from 1964. This one, I have to say, I probably listen to this one more now than Freewheeling, but I don't think it's as impactful and influential as Freewheeling. And I don't think it has the same depth of track listing, in the track listing. I mean, you've got Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, Ballad of Hollis Brown, One Too Many Mornings. It's got some really good tracks on there, but I think it's going in the B tier simply because it's not quite as, doesn't have quite the depth that Freewheeling has, but it's a great album as well, so that's where it's going to go. Right, another side of Bob Dylan, which is a bit of a transition record. This was one that came out later in '64, after Dylan had been on a bit of a journey of self-discovery. He'd been on that long road trip around America with Bob Newirth and a couple of other people, and written Mr. Tambourine Man by this point. So he was very much on his way out of the topical songwriting scene at this stage, and for that reason it's an important album. I think he had to make this album in order to make the stuff that came after it. But I'll always have a soft spot for it because it was actually the first CD of Dylan's that I bought way back like 10, 12 years ago now. And I used to just, because it was the only thing I had of his, I would just play it to death. And I do go back to it occasionally. I love To Ramona, My Back Pages, even some of the funnier songs on here, like I Shall Be Free number 10. So I think I'm going to put it in the C or the B tier. I'm going to put it in the B tier because there's no real weak moments on here. So I think it deserves to go in the B tier. Right, bring it all back home. We're now getting into the real heavy hitters of the 60s. And Bring It All Back Home, as everybody knows, is an absolute masterpiece. And if you've watched my review, you'll know it's one of my favourite Dylan albums of all time. Definitely up there in the top 3 or 4. So it's going straight into the S tier. Obviously, we've got the electric moments on here. We've got the second half, which was miraculously recorded in like, I think it was one afternoon. And you've got, you know, just so many high points on there. Only a couple of moments that are kind of lackluster, but they're still good moments. So straight into the S tier for me with Bring It All Back Home. Okay. Just have a sip of coffee before we move on to Highway 61. Now, this again has to go in the S tier, but I would say it's an album that I don't return to as much as I would expect, but when I do return to it, I'm kind of blown away every time. You've got obviously Like a Rolling Stone, which is one of his biggest hits and probably in my top 5 Dylan tracks. Just like Tom Thumb's Blues, I love that song. Ballad of a Thin Man. I've always said I'm not a big fan of the studio version of that song, but still, I think Desolation Row, obviously, so it deserves to go in the S tier. This is considered by many to be Dylan's best work. So yeah, S tier all the way for Highway 61. And I don't think I need to say too much about putting Blonde on Blonde in the S tier. My favourite album of all time. Always, well, it has been now for a decade or so, and it will continue to be just an album that has changed my life in so many ways. And hopefully I'll be doing a review of Blonde on Blonde at some stage. I want to try and do it with my brother because he's also a big Dylan fan, so I thought it would be a cool idea to do it with him. But yeah, for the purposes of the tier list, all I will say is it's a masterpiece and it's an S tier album all the way. Right, so we're moving out of the mid-60s into John Wesley Harding from 67. Now, this was an album that was so against the grain, and it's kind of a standalone in Dylan's discography, I would say. Purely for the fact that obviously this was recorded during 1967 when the Beatles were making Sgt. Pepper. The whole of the music industry, the popular music industry, was heading in one direction, and Dylan was at right angles to that. He was going in the opposite direction. And I think this is probably the most underrated Dylan album. It's not that it's underrated necessarily, but it's not talked about enough. Now, do I think it's an S tier record? No, I don't think it's an S tier record, so it's going to go in the A tier. But so many great songs on there, and just a really stripped back Dylan album, but it does have some really interesting instrumentals as well, so I think A tier is where it belongs. Right, Nashville Skyline is next, and this is Dylan's first kind of country record. He was working a lot with Johnny Cash, obviously, at the time. And I have to say that I never used to be too fond of this record. I just thought that it was kind of a bit of a letdown compared to what came before, and I still think that to a certain degree. But despite it only being just over half an hour, I think it does have some really good redeeming moments where it just sounds great, and I think there's some really, it's a really good listening experience. So I'm going to put it in the B tier for that reason. I think it's a solid record. It's obviously not to the same standard of what we've just ranked before it, but I think it deserves to go into the B tier. Next up we have Self-Portrait, which was the the album that got slated by critics at the time. Was it Greil Marcus that had the famous line, what is this shit, or something? So obviously it was hated at the time it came out, but I have to say I've actually just pulled out my copy, which I'll show you quickly. Here's my copy, which is actually my most recent Bob Dylan album that I picked up on vinyl, which is cool to have. But yeah, I don't think it's as bad as people made out in the first place. I know it's got, you know, more popular since it came out, but it is a kind of more of a compilation album. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a studio album. It's just things that Dylan pieced together, and it certainly isn't a very cohesive, polished piece of work. So I'm going to put it in the D tier for that reason. It's definitely not an F tier record, but it's I think D is where it belongs. Right, New Morning from 1970. This is an album that I've really enjoyed in the past. I love songs like Day of the Locust, Went to See the Gypsy, If Not For You. It's got some standout tracks. I think it also has some kind of disappointing tracks that don't really do it for me. So I think my overwhelming feeling with New Morning is that Dylan could just do so much better than this. And even at this point in his career where he was struggling, obviously I think he was struggling with like writer's block at this point. But I still think he can do better than New Morning. I think it's not quite as well, it doesn't have its own identity in the same way that Nashville Skyline does. So I'm going to put it in the C tier. It's difficult. I'm close to putting it in the B tier, but I'm going to put it in the C tier. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, which is a soundtrack album that Dylan did for the movie that he starred in, called Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid from 1973, I believe. Again, this is a difficult one to rank because I don't really listen to it. I'll put it in the C tier because I can't really have too much of an opinion on it. Same goes for the next album. I do have Dylan, which is self-titled, I guess, from 1973. It's considered by many to be one of his worst albums, certainly of the first couple of decades of his career, simply because I think he had to put this out to kind of satisfy the Columbia contract, and it's just not very good. It's got a nice cover of Mr. Bojangles on there, but apart from that, it doesn't really have much to write home about. Do I think it's an F tier record? I'm going to put it in the F tier. I don't think it. Yeah, I think it probably is one of his worst records. So if we're going off that, then for another artist, it might not be an F tier. But when we're looking at the quality of Dylan's songwriting and his work, it's just not very good at all. So F tier is where it's going to go. Okay, Planet Waves from 1974. This is a nice return to form, I have to say. I think, again, it's one of his most underrated records, certainly of the 70s. Forever Young, Dirge, some good tracks on there. But I just think, considering what he released just after this, I don't think it really stacks up against the majority of his best work. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in the C tier. I don't think it quite makes the B tier for me. Okay, now we're getting into the mid-70s, and we've got, of course, the masterpiece, one of the greatest love/heartbreak albums of all time, and that is Blood on the Tracks. And this goes straight into the S tier for obvious reasons. Many people would cite this as their favourite Dylan album. It's not my favourite Dylan album. I think it's second or third at least, but it's not my favourite. However, of course, we've got Tangled Up in Blue, we've got Idiot Wind, we've got Meet Me in the Morning, we've got Buckets of Rain, we've got Shelter from the Storm. I mean, literally the depth of songwriting, the depth of craftsmanship on this record is just outstanding. It's, yeah, one of the best albums ever made, in my opinion. So S tier all the way for Blood on the Tracks. Next up we have the Basement Tapes, which was released, I think, by Robbie Robertson, or was put together by Robbie Robertson as a kind of response to all of the bootlegs that were coming out of the Basement Tapes from obviously 1967. It's a nice compilation. I have to say I don't really listen to it because there are, obviously we've got the bootleg series, which is a big favourite of mine, and that's a much more comprehensive, complete set of Basement Tapes, whereas this is a kind of curated version, obviously. So I think because of the quality of the tracks, I'm going to put it in the B tier, just because we've got, you know, so many great Dylan originals on the Basement Tapes, and it's just one of my favourite periods of his career. So for that reason, I think it's a decent effort as well by Robbie Robertson to put something out that was, you know, included the best tracks from that era. So B tier it is for that one. Okay, Desire. Now again, Desire could be seen in a number of ways. I don't think it obviously is not as good as Blood on the Tracks for most people, and myself included, but we've got Hurricane on there, we've got Isis, we've got One More Cup of Coffee, which are three, I think, absolutely outstanding tracks. And if you haven't watched the Rolling Thunder review documentary by Scorsese, those tracks just have a whole new lease of life with the live performances, so you should definitely go and watch that. And I think it's just a stunning record. I think it's a really solid record. It's definitely not S tier. Is it an A tier record? I think it is an A tier. I think, again, when I'm ranking these records, it's important to kind of see, are they, you know, significant departure and progression from what the artist has done before. And I think in Desire's case, it does have, you know, it's got that Scarlett Rivera violin. It's got just this very, it's very interesting and very individual sound to it that you don't find on many other albums of Dylan's or anyone, to be honest. So I think for that reason, I'm going to put it in the A tier, because I think it was just a really brave attempt by Dylan to put something out that sounded completely different to what had come before. So yeah, I'm going to put it in the A tier. Next up, we have Street Legal from '78, and it's a good record, but it's nothing special. It's not an album that I kind of am inspired to go back and listen to very, very regularly. So I think for that reason, it's going to go C tier. You know, it's good. It's certainly not a poor record, but it doesn't. I don't think it deserves to go any higher than C. Okay, we're into the Born Again trilogy, which began in *79 with Slow Train Coming, and this is my favourite of the three records from that era. Slow Train Coming. I really enjoy the production on here by Jerry Wexler. I think some of the tracks on here, like Precious Angel, Gotta Serve Somebody, When He Returns, I think there's just some really good track listing on here. I think the track listing is really good on here, you know, despite what you might think about Dylan becoming born again, as it, you know, obviously going through this phase. Despite what you think about the subject matter, I think the songwriting is good. I think the production is great, as I said. So I think this for me is going to go B tier. I think it's a really good Dylan album and very listenable. Shot of Love, which I think Dylan described as probably one of his, I think, didn't he say it was like his best album or something? I know he's prone to saying things that are controversial, to say the least, but I think there's something to what he says, because there is certainly something about Shot of Love which is great. I think it could have been so much better had he rearranged some of the tracks and maybe put a couple of different songs in there. But it has got some good moments, so I'm going to put it in the C tier. It's a good album. Saved, which is considered to be like the final installment in that Born Again trilogy, and I do think it's the worst by quite some distance, so I'm going to put it in the D tier. It's not the worst album he ever made by any means, but it's not good. It's not great at all. And again, it's not an album that I choose to go back and put on very regularly. Thankfully, we take a step up with the next album, which is Infidels from, is it 83? And this includes probably my favourite Dylan song of the 80s, which is Joker Man. I just think that song is an absolute masterpiece. We've got Neighborhood Bully on there, Sweetheart Like You. Really good album. I think it deserves to go quite high on this ranking. But do I put it in the B or the C tier? I don't know whether it deserves to go in the B tier. Is it as good as Times They Are Changing? No. Is it as good as Slow Train Coming? Possibly. Oh, it's difficult. Again, it's not an album that I go back and listen to a lot, but I do think it has some good tracks. So I'm gonna put it in the C tier, but it is very much on the borderline between the C and the B for me. Moving on, Empire Burlesque, which is unfortunately a bit of a downturn. This next period is not my favourite. I do have this album on vinyl, but I have to say it's so forgettable. It does have some couple of good moments on it, but it's just so forgettable, so it's going in the D tier. Knocked Out Loaded from, I can't remember what year that came out. I think this takes the cake for the worst album cover that Dylan ever put out. I just hate that album cover, always have. Like the font choices and the artwork is just so dated. Again, a couple of good moments on there, but it's so forgettable. I'm struggling to remember any of the tracks, so D tier again for me. Down in the Groove, F tier, just not very good at all. Oh Mercy is one of my favourites of the 80s. Might even be my favourite of the 80s actually. Some really great moments on there. Everything is Broken, Political World, Man in the Long Black Coat, should I say. Really good piece of work, and I think, is it Daniel Lanois that did the production on there? It sounds really fresh, even to this day. Putting it on, it doesn't sound like an album that came out in the late 80s, so I'm going to put it in B tier. I think it's probably my favourite of the 80s, so yeah, B tier for Oh Mercy. Under the Red Sky, D tier, possibly even F tier, but I'm going to leave it in the D tier. Again, this album and the next album, actually, the next two, I haven't listened to in God knows how long. In fact, Good As I've Been to You, which is the next album, I don't think I've listened to that album more than twice, all the way through. So I'm going to put them in the D tier just as a kind of default, because I haven't listened to them enough to give them a fair chance. But I just know if they're not enticing me to go back and listen to them, then they're probably not up to scratch. World Gone Wrong is a similar case. It does have a good track. What's that track called? It's got blood in the title. Again, this is an album that I really should revisit, because I do remember it being better than the few that came before it. But for the sake of this tier list, I'm going to put it in the D tier. Thankfully, we're taking a step up with the next album, which is Time Out of Mind from 97. Now, this is the album that won the Grammy. Did it win the Grammy? I think it did. Just this really, really good album, I think, from start to finish. It doesn't have too many weak moments. Again, I don't listen to it an awful lot. But Highlands, which is the final track on there, I think at the time was Dylan's longest track before he released Tempest. Highlands is a great track, and there's plenty of other songs on there that I'm forgetting now. Let me pull the record out. Here it is. We've got Lovesick on there. Standing in the Doorway is probably my favourite track. Trying to Get to Heaven, Not Dark Yet. I think Not Dark Yet was the song that won the Grammy. And then you got the whole of side 4, which is Highlands. Yeah, absolutely stunning record. But it's definitely not an S tier record for me personally, because I just don't listen to it enough to put it in the S tier. But I think it deserves to go in the A tier. I think it does. B or A tier. No, I'm going to put it in a B tier because again, I just don't listen to it enough to put it in the A tier. Love and Theft is quite a similar case. Let me pull that record out as well. This is the music on vinyl reissue, which is really nicely done. It came out in 2001 during kind of a bit of a resurgence for Dylan, obviously with Time Out of Mind and this record. It's good. It really is a good record, but it's not as good as Time Out of Mind. Is it better than Infidels? Is it better than Planet Waves, New Morning? No, I'm going to put it in the C tier. I think it's good, but again, it doesn't quite have the depth in the kind of the songwriting. I mean, maybe look at some of the tracks on there. Tweedledee and Tweedledum, Mississippi, Summer Days, Lonesome Day Blues. Yeah, I mean, it does have some really solid tracks, but I'm just struggling to put it above the B tier just because they're not the most memorable tracks. It's not like, you know, there's classics on there or anything. And I think to be in the B tier and above, it has to be something you go back to quite often. So I'm going to leave it in the C tier. Modern Times, it's an album that I don't have on vinyl, and I have to say I haven't listened to an awful lot. But I remember it being good. Remember it being pretty solid. Not as good as Love and Theft, not as good as Time Out of Mind. I'll put it in the C tier again. Together Through Life, again, I remember being good, but I have to say, I apologise for this, but I just haven't listened to these records in so long. My memory is failing me right now. So Together Through Life, I'm sure I'll get some stick if I put it any lower than C tier, so it's going to go in the C tier. Christmas in the Heart, the one that everybody was waiting for, obviously. When did this come out? 2009 or something? This Christmas album, which is quite apt at the moment. We're a few days after Christmas. Yeah, it's not great. I was not a fan of Dylan's vocals on this album. I think they just sound... They don't fit very well with the Christmas theme for me. You know, you got that song Must Be Santa, which is, I have to say, it's quite a catchy tune. But this is going to go in the D tier for me. I'm not feeling mean enough to put it in the F tier, but it's not far off being F tier. Right, we're moving into the final phase now of his discography with Tempest, which again I have on vinyl, which I will pull out. This was the first Dylan album that I bought on release day. I remember buying this the day it came out, and it was a great moment. Having a brand new Dylan album, which was full of original numbers, you know, songs that he'd written himself, which at the time was a rare occurrence. And since 2012, we've only had one more record where he has put out original songs. So, Tempest is a good record. Again, is it as good as Time Out of Mind? I do like Long and Wasted Years. I do like Scarlet Town. I like the John Lennon dedication, Roll On John. So there are some really good moments on there. Obviously, you got the Tempest track about the Titanic. It's a good record. It's a really good record. I think it doesn't get enough praise. Is it better than New Morning, though? You know what? I think considering the kind of period that he was operating in, you know, obviously he was, 60, 65 at this time. Or was he? No, he was like 70 at this time. I think considering that, I think this is, again, it's an album that was a bit different to what he'd done before. It has a different sound to it, different style. And to be fair, it is an album that I enjoy going back to. And I think that's an important criteria to fulfill when ranking albums, is like, how much do you want to listen to them? You know, it's not all about the kind of objective, what people think of them as a whole. It's about what you enjoy to listen to. And for me, Tempest is one of his most listenable records, certainly of the recent period. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in the B tier. Shadows in the Night. I'm not really a big fan of the Frank Sinatra period, which covers this record and the next couple. It's just nothing to me. It's just really not. It doesn't really do much for me. It's just a bit of nothing. You know, they're pleasant enough tracks, and I do think he does good versions of them, but I just struggle to see the kind of creativity in it. So for me, Shadows in the Night and Fallen Angels, which is the next record, it's going to go in the D tier. Triplicate is a bit of an exception to that rule, because I think Triplicate is, I've only listened to it, I think, once all the way through. I've listened to individual parts quite often. And I have to say, there are some nice numbers on there, and I think he did, he did some tracks that I'm a bit more fond of. And it is a very long, obviously it's a Triplicate album. I think it's a triple vinyl, which I don't have, unfortunately. Do I put it above D tier? Again, because I don't really have the experience of listening to it an awful lot, I'm going to put it in the C tier. Because from the times I have listened to it, I've enjoyed it. So I'm going to leave it in the C tier. I think that's it. It's a good place for it. Right, we're down to the final record, which is 2020's Rough and Rowdy Ways, which I also have. Where is it? Down here. Here it is. Dylan's most recent work. Again, original material that he put out last year. And again, I think there's some really good moments on Rough and Rowdy Ways. I think, I did a review of Murder Most Foul and I Contain Multitudes. I still think those songs have redeeming qualities, but they have dropped off a bit in terms of my enjoyment of them, and they don't do it for me in the same way anymore. But I like, I like the majority of the tracks on Rough and Rowdy Ways, but for me, I can't put it above C tier. I can't put it above C tier. I think the critics were a little bit OTT when they reviewed this album. I think, it got absolutely rave reviews, and I think it was a case of there being such a drought in terms of Dylan's original work. I think, obviously it was the first original album he'd put out since Tempest. So I think there was a bit of a longing and lusting for original Dylan material, and it did fulfill that. It did quench that thirst to some degree, but for me, it's not of the, it doesn't go above C tier for me. So I'm going to put it in the C tier. So you can see that is my final tier ranking of Bob Dylan's studio albums. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Let me know if you would have moved any of these around. We've got Bring It All Back Home, Highway 61, Blonde on Blonde, and Blood on the Tracks in the S tier. I don't think that will surprise anybody. That might be consistent. Maybe other people would put Freewheeling in there. I don't know. The only thing, looking at it now, Times They Are Changing is a good album. And it maybe deserves to be A tier. I'm actually thinking the same goes for Time Out of Mind and Oh Mercy. Possibly they deserve to go in A tier. I'm going to put Time Out of Mind. No, sorry, I'm going to put Oh Mercy in A tier. Time Out of Mind is close to being A tier, but I don't listen to it as much as Oh Mercy. So we got 4 in the S tier, 4 in the A tier, and a few more in the B tier. Majority are in C, and we've got a good number in the D tier, which are kind of, it's the case for most artists, certainly if they've spanned this amount of time. This is 6-7 decades now worth of work. There's going to be some poorer, there's going to be some substandard albums in there. That's just the nature of the beast. But let me know what you think of my ranking. I will post it in the description for you to look at, but obviously you can see it right here. So be interested to know what you guys think. Merry Christmas to everybody out there, and Happy New Year. Obviously I hope you had a good Christmas and it wasn't too interrupted, despite obviously all of the weird times that we're living through at the moment, I do hope you manage to make the most of it in some ways. Anyway, it's good fun to do this tier list. I might do more stuff like this in the future. Maybe I'll do a Beatles one at some point. In the meantime, I think I've rambled on for long enough. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.